Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We're actually taking a 500-year-old text written by a guy who's basically famous for being ruthless and discovering that it's literally the ultimate survival code for our volatile modern world. We're looking at Niccolo Machiavelli's most critical insights, but not as some dusty historical artifact, right? We're using it as a high-octane mental model for handling systemic chaos and uncertainty. If you've ever wondered why some people, or organizations for that matter, just absolutely thrive when everything else falls apart, well, you're exactly in the right place.
Okay, let's take a quick look at the roadmap. We'll start off by exposing the illusion of stability, then we'll break down fortune versus virtue. After that, we'll unpack the psychology of chaos, apply all this to modern cross-domain battlefields, and finally, look at exactly how to outperform fortune.
All right, part one, the illusion of stability, or basically unmasking our absolute greatest psychological blind spot. To properly decode this whole thing, we have to start by confronting this massive, inherent bias in how we perceive the systems around us. We live in a world that constantly tricks us into feeling secure. And the kicker? That false security is exactly what sets the stage for massive disruption.
So it forces us to ask a really tough question. Why do seemingly invincible systems just suddenly collapse? I mean, think about historical empires, massive corporate monopolies, or even modern financial markets. During periods of low volatility, these systems look totally solid, right? Like nothing could bring them down. But underneath the surface, inertia is building. Hidden structural weaknesses are accumulating completely out of sight.
And this illusion of stability, this really dangerous complacency, is exactly what Niccolo Machiavelli diagnosed 500 years ago in chapter 25 of his infamous text, The Prince. He watched the shifting powers and sudden political collapses of his own era and realized something profound. Perceived stability is very often just a period of low visible volatility right before a massive, massive disruption. He synthesized this into a really brilliant core mechanism. He basically theorized that reality is a constant, unyielding tension between fortune, which represents pure external randomness, unpredictable shifts, systemic shocks, and human agency. He recognized that, yeah, fortune introduces total randomness that rewards or destroys you regardless of merit, but its power isn't absolute. You can actually constrain that chaos through sheer preparedness and adaptability.
Which brings us to part two, fortune versus virtue, the binary mechanism of reality. Let's see how this dynamic builds into the ultimate binary mechanism that dictates whether you win or lose in a totally unpredictable environment. It's essentially a stochastic control system where the sheer speed of your adaptation completely determines your survival.
Now, here's the crucial point. Machiavelli's concept of virtù has absolutely nothing to do with being a good or moral person. In this framework, virtù is highly kinetic. It's aggressive, strategic action in the sheer speed of your adaptation relative to the speed of the environmental change. It's that active human capacity to look at a systemic shock and immediately find the leverage point within it. Fortune dictates the distribution of an opportunity, sure, but virtù determines who actually captures it.
And this dynamic brilliantly illustrates the hidden structural rule of the universe. Passive systems rely on stability and they get absolutely crushed by shocks. On the flip side, aggressive adaptation systems anticipate volatility and exploit those exact same shocks for asymmetric opportunities. Think about it. The passive loop relies on peace, underprepares, gets hit by a shock, and loses all agency. But the aggressive loop? It expects the shock, prepares for it, and actually uses that disruption to leapfrog the competition.
Moving on to part three, the psychology of chaos. Let's talk about why our brains constantly betray us during regime shifts. This is the major sticking point, right? If this rule of aggressive adaptability is so mathematically obvious, why do we constantly fail to execute it when chaos actually hits? Why do incredibly smart people just freeze up when the market turns or an industry shifts? Well, it's because our brains literally betray us. Machiavelli identified some massive psychological blind spots here. First, we suffer from the illusion of stability, where we just sort of assume current conditions will persist forever. Then, we get hit with shock response bias. We desperately want to believe things will just go back to normal. So, kind of like a deer in headlights, we just sit and wait. We react far too slowly to structural change, and all the while, the aggressive adapters are taking all our market share.
And then, oh man, there's retrospective skill attribution. We have this incredibly dangerous psychological habit of looking backward and assuming that mere good timing was actually our own brilliant strategy. During a bull market, it's really easy to think your passive system is pure genius. But confusing systemic luck with personal merit, that means dropping your guard completely for when the environment suddenly flips.
All right, part four, modern cross-domain battlefields.
let's pull this theory straight out of Renaissance Italy. We need to drop this framework right into the crosshairs of modern, hyper-complex systems. Because, this isn't just about Renaissance kings plotting against each other anymore. This is a universal law of complex environments today.
Whether you're navigating shifting market regimes in day trading, where survival entirely depends on adapting your exposure rather than predicting direction, or you're defending against unexpected attack vectors in cybersecurity, the rule holds universally true. It's just like a grandmaster in chess who has to constantly reevaluate the board rather than stick to some fixed script. Survival depends entirely on continuous adaptation. Because, let's face it, the initial plan literally never survives contact with volatile reality. But we do have to recognize Machiavelli's one major blind spot here. 500 years ago, he assumed that a single individual could meaningfully out-adapt systemic volatility. But in our modern era with global finance, AI, insanely complex corporate ecosystems, virtue isn't just an individual ruler's personal skill anymore. Actually, it's about building distributed adaptive capacity across entire institutional command networks. Your whole organization basically needs to become a sensory organ for volatility. To win at that organizational scale, you absolutely must implement an aggressive adaptation loop. Your system has to move continuously. First, you anticipate volatility as a permanent state. Next, you prepare flexible responses. Then, when the shock inevitably hits, you exploit it. And finally, you translate that exploitation into increased power and even more adaptability. You don't just weather the storm, guys. You literally use the storm to power your engine. Which brings us to our final section, how to outperform fortune. This is the master playbook for structural resilience. Now we finally arrive at the actionable part, how you can actually design your life, your business, and your systems to absorb these inevitable regime shifts. Let's look at the specific failure conditions and how to counter them. Definitely keep this essential cheat sheet in mind. It contrasts the failure conditions, like relying blindly on past success patterns or underestimating rare events, with Machiavellian counter-strategies. And these counter-strategies, they require treating stability as a temporary illusion, maintaining a highly flexible strategic posture, building massive optionality, and pivoting rapidly during windows of uncertainty. A system will always collapse when the environmental shift outpaces its ability to adapt, so your adaptation speed must always be faster than the environmental shift.
The dominant pattern across all of this source material is simple, universal, and honestly incredibly brutal. Systemic randomness destroys rigid structures while deeply empowering adaptive ones. High volatility environments strip away the illusion of stability and severely punish the inflexible. The chaos essentially acts as a filter, wiping out the passive and handing the future right over to the dynamic.
And this right here is the ultimate master takeaway for this entire explainer. It distills 500 years of strategic philosophy into one undeniable truth. You cannot stop the market from crashing. You cannot prevent a cyber attack. And you certainly can't freeze time. The external force of fortune is completely out of your hands. But your rigidity, your failure to build a flexible, responsive system, well, that is entirely a choice.
So, as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a critical question to evaluate your own life and organizations. If the next structural shock hits tomorrow, are you building systems that foolishly try to oppose fortune and cling to the past? Or are you building systems that convert structured uncertainty into a massive strategic advantage? Prepare your virtue and be ready to move when the world shifts.